and hopefully you are able to see the webcams of our panel today, speaking to you from across North America. And we're going to talk today about SEM and the efforts that it takes to really do this as an institution. And so we've got a number of aspects of this we want to address today and discuss with you. But first things first, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping here. We want to make sure that everyone kind of knows the rules of the road. First of all, you will note that if you'd like to ask some questions today, we really encourage you to be thinking of your questions and writing them in the questions box on this interactive panel for the webinar as we go along. So as you're thinking of something, jot it down, put it in the question panel, and we'll gather up a few of those questions towards the end of this when we get to the Q&A section. And we'll be pulling from that. If you're calling in today and you're just on a phone line, then towards the end of this, we may unmute the lines if we have time. We'll see how the question flow goes at that point with it. But just know that if you're on a phone line, we'll try and accommodate you if we have time to be able to ask questions as well. Lastly, following this webinar, you're going to receive a little email with a survey, and we really hope you'll complete that survey. But as an extra added bonus, that will give you access to this webinar in the archive. So it is being recorded today, and it will be available after this webinar takes place online as an archived recording. Great. There's the housekeeping. Now let's kind of move into the fun of this, the meat of this. I'm really pleased to be joined today with some experts in the field on SEM. Coming to you, we have with us Brent Gage, Jody Gordon, and Christine Curlin, and I'm Tom Green. You should have received information on our bios, etc., from the webinar information or online on the website for this. So we're not going to dive into more of our backgrounds and bios, other than I will say I've worked with these folks for many years on various projects, and they all have extensive backgrounds in creating strong, effective teams and leading organizations towards creating really strong enrollment programs. And they're going to share those perspectives as we go today. My job here is to really introduce a few topics and then toss it out to our panelists and let them give you some feedback on each of those. We've got 4 things here. We may not get to all 4. We'll see how our discussion goes today, but we'll at least try and move to 3 of the 4 if we can. All right, great. So let's dig in. The first topic that we have today is going to be on organizational structures. And this is a slide that I've used in the past. It's published in some of our ACRO books, and it talks a little bit about how we might think about teams and putting teams together at an organization. It's a very generic type of slide, and of course, you know, it doesn't mean that you have to implement this exactly on a campus as you see it here. But the idea is that there's some, you know, linkage to the executive structure of the organization, the people who see the mission, the budget, the vision of the organization, and see across all the different aspects of the organization. That there is some type of project steering committee that's going to guide this, keep it on track, and also help people communicate with each other. We also, will on many occasions have a recruitment and a retention council. In other words, you're working on both aspects of this, that you have to improve the students you're recruiting and getting into the organization. And then, of course, you all importantly have to be able to retain and complete them and help them meet their educational goals. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see, not because it's on the lowest rung, but because it holds up the whole thing, is a data team and the absolute necessity of infusing decision-making with information and data so that you can make smarter decisions about enrollment as you do that, and get out of the hunch way of making enrollment decisions and really going into informed decision-making. So let's talk about organizational structure. And for our panelists, in your work at your own institutions over the years and working with others to create and implement SEM plans, How have you arranged teams to make them as effective as possible? And let's start first of all with formal structure, meaning the org chart. How have you seen organizations arrange themselves to be effective from an org chart point of view? Anybody? Brent, would you like to start this one?
Sure. Structure matters, and it's really important because whether it's a strategic plan or a SEM plan that you're trying to build and orchestrate, you need to look at your organization to say, are we structured to facilitate the things that we say are important? So, for example, at my institution at the University of Iowa, we think about freshman students and we think about transfer students, international students, student retention. So as I look at my org chart and we're going to develop strategies or tactics to try to achieve institutional goals, do I have the structures in place to be able to facilitate and support those goals? For example, if I have a person who's in charge of transfer recruitment, but also campus visit programs and helps with international, which one of those things is important to that staff member? How are they going to spend their time? So I think in looking at your organization, does it align with the way you're building your goals? And are those goals reflective of what the institutional strategic plan is? Because sometimes being able to tighten up your organizational structure to give you additional focus and responsibility for staff members gives you a lot better chance to really be able to put out those key performance indicators and track them back to individual efforts and tactics that you may do to try to achieve those larger goals.
Great. Christine or Jody, would you like to add on to that?
I'll add something. I often work with smaller schools, with community colleges, smaller universities, and I have found that I'll reverse from what Brent is saying, and he's saying very good things, that often I'm finding that there is a committee structure that gets formed that does the work of SEM. And the way that I look at alignment with the organization is who's in charge, and making sure that there is the executive leadership buy-in, and perhaps even using executives as co-chairs of the committee. That is what essentially would become the SEM steering committee. And in that respect, I'm often encouraging the buy-in of both the academic, the instructional folks, and the student affairs folks, because they tend to have the largest pieces of action in what the SEM planning is. So again, I tend to look at schools that are more likely to have a committee structure that has representatives from a wide variety of parts of the organization, and make sure that the chairing of it, that the championing of it is rooted at the executive level. The other part of that, of course, is who's on the committee. How do you look at your organization, as Brent mentioned, and make sure that you've got the right people at the table and that they know what they're doing there. And so, of course, I look for broad representation, but I also look at the caveat, and Tom, I think I may have learned this from you. Don't have a committee that's any larger than you can fit in a van. Or the other thing I heard was it needs to be at most a 2-pizza committee, so that you're not really overburdening the situation with that. The other folks I like to bring to the table, and this again is alignment with the organization, are the budget folks. Much of what we do in SEM, I think, has to do with the institutional health of the student success angle, as well as the viability of the institution, and making sure that what they're looking at has a relationship to how the institution is solving some of its financial questions. So I try to have a lot of people represented, not too many people represented. I try to have a linkage with the executive and the champions there.
Great. Jody?
I think not much more to add, but to play off of Brent's point about structure matters, I think what also matters is what is the impetus for wanting to form any kind of structure at your institution, whether it be formal or informal. And in some cases, I've worked with schools where they've had a very specific directive, whether it's come through their strategic plan or even from their senior leaders as to how they want to achieve that strategic plan. And that is driving structure. In other cases, there's something that's happened at the institution. And so they're making a decision in response to what's happening at the institution. And that can be a very different structure as well. So I think what matters is, why are you doing this work? What do you hope to achieve through this work? And that can sometimes answer the question as to how are we going to come together in order to achieve that.
That's a great point. Oh, go ahead, Christine.
I'd like to build on the statement of structure matters. Structure matters in a lot of different ways. It certainly does matter when you're recognizing what's going on at your institution. I've had some experiences with institutions that get, as some folks say, stuck on structure. They get stuck on how to do SEM because they're so busy thinking about, do we need a vice president? Do we need a committee? They just get stuck on how to even organize themselves around it. This takes them down many roads that are not very productive. So I will say, in a devil's advocate point of view, sometimes I see that colleges might want to think about how to start SEM with a perhaps less than formal structure and acknowledge that they may be moving towards understanding more how SEM would fit into their organization and accept the evolution of their SEM process. Otherwise, I find that they just get delayed because they can't figure out the absolutely perfect structure.
Yeah, great points. And I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize here for our audience is that, there are many different ways to go about this. It's really about reading culture and understanding where the institution is today, what it needs for the next, say, 5 years in order to move the needle, to change some outcome that you're trying to change. That's almost always why SEM plans get started, is because the institution wants a different enrollment outcome that it has at that time. And so understanding what the most important parts of that are can be very important. I just wanted to reflect back on a couple of things that all of you said. One was about Brent, about making sure you've got the support to meet your goals. So is your team aligned to be successful with that? And that just made me think so much of the fact that we often lump more things on to job descriptions, but we rarely review those and take things out or reorganize our team in a way that makes more sense for what we need today. And I think that's one of the things that we see a lot with organizations when they're trying to get results, that they've assigned 7 or 8 things. And it's not just one type of institution, but I think a lot of times community colleges often have such small staff in any kind of recruitment or admissions work that they often have 8 or 9 different duties, dual enrollment, outreach, et cetera. And that can often be a hindrance to meeting those.
Well, another thing, Tom, that that's really important when you think about in the SEM context, just because you're going to have maybe a charge from the senior leadership that we need a SEM plan to achieve these goals, that doesn't mean within the organization the challenges that different units are going to have are going to be very different from one another. You may have one unit that has a lot of capacity and wants to grow. You may have another unit that can't manage the volume of applications and students they have due to limitations on enrollment. So I also think that sometimes when you think about how you're going to organize and put together a group, don't assume that you're all trying to solve the same problem, because as institutions are complex, there's a lot of things that are going on. They're going to compete with one another. It can be all managed in a well-articulated SEM plan and a SEM organization.
I think of the institutions, Brent, that have more nursing or more engineering applicants than they can possibly handle. And so, those faculties are working hard to, try and control swirl and trying to make sure expectations are clear and to get the best of the best for their programs. And other programs at the institution may be severely under-enrolled at exactly the same time. And it's not like we can magically divert engineering students into another major or nursing students to another major. Take your pick of which over-enrolled, under-enrolled programs you may wish, but those varying points of view and needs at the time may be highly different, even among your faculties or even other administrative offices. Great point.
Yeah. What I often say is when the institutional leadership sets the charge, okay, the SEM plan is to take the pieces of the various units around campus and put that puzzle together. Because if the president charges the SEM group to improve quality, but we want to stay at the same size, and all the units come back and say we want to grow by 5%, those puzzle pieces don't fit. So I think that organization is really important, that everyone really clearly understand what the end outcome you're aspiring for, but that means lots of combinations of different things coming together to fit what that goal is.
Great, and you're teeing us up well for our next topic, and I just want to ask one more thing on this one before we move along, and that is, from the vantage point of many of the folks who are on this call who are thinking about being an enrollment manager or are an enrollment manager, and they're thinking about their own situation. Can we talk a little bit about influence in that role? That do you have the organizational teams that will help you be successful? Have you assembled the units that you can have direct responsibility for in the formal setting in order to do that? Can you reflect a little bit on that?
Well,
who would like? Yeah, Jody, go ahead.
Sure. I think we can describe the ideal world. If you had the responsibility for all of the units that you want to be involved and engaged, that's wonderful, but that's often not the case, especially at different sizes of institutions. And so in that response, I think allies matter considerably. How you can help align those around the institution to come together under the auspices of of student success, and that really is what our strategic enrollment management planning is about, can have a huge impact. And so I would push towards having a good sense of who those allies are. And one that often gets forgotten is your student unions, your student associations as a key ally in supporting student success and SEM planning. But it's the key leaders that you can connect to, and that includes faculty who show an understanding and a real strong connection to student success are often the folks that will come to the table to support, whether you're aligned organizationally or not. You can still rely on some of those key individuals to be there to support the planning that needs to be done, to respond to the strategic plan that you may have in place that is really about who you aspire to be.
Great. Okay.
And I often say, Tom, if you don't tell your story, somebody will tell it for you. And so I think anytime you're involved in SEM planning, you have to get out and say what you're doing, why you're doing it, and why it's important. And say it to anyone who will listen to you, because again, transparency is really important in this process, because as human beings, we all wonder, what's in it for me? And so I think as we hit with different populations, whether it be a student, a faculty member, administrative group, whoever the group is, I think telling that story of why this is important from their perspective and their vantage point is really important, whether it's you doing it or folks that are serving on your committees.
Great. And the big takeaway here is, good committees fit in a minivan, or they're two pizza committees, right? Keep them small, keep them nimble. All right, very good. Well, the next topic we have is probably the one that gets discussed the most when we do SEM planning workshops or when we have conversations with colleagues, and that is getting buy-in and really helping the organization see its role in SEM and getting as I like to say, everybody pulling on the same end of the rope, so that we're all working together in this, and that can be very, very challenging. So we know that SEM can't be done by one office. Even if you have 8 or 9 units reporting to you as the vice president or vice provost of enrollment somewhere, you can only have so much influence and so much scope of responsibility. So how do you create buy-in from people at the institution who don't work in an enrollment management or enrollment services office. And that could be faculty, but it also could be other administrative units. So let's open that one up and talk about getting buy-in from folks. And I'm going to ask Christine, would you mind taking this one first?
Okay, I'll start, and I will start based on what Brent said about telling your story. One of the stages I like to go through with SEM work is distilling the data into the story and into the issues that really push people's buttons, that make you say, we've got to do something about that. Developing the story and telling the story and having it be the kind of story that people say, we have to do something. It's your elevator speech. It is your attempt to crystallize for folks why this might be important. It may not affect them directly. They may think it probably does affect them, but it needs to be something that is told in a narrative, of course, backed up by the data you've found. I think we build our cultures on stories, and it becomes so important to add that to when you say we're trying to get buy-in. What you're really trying to do is build the culture, the ethos of people who care about the enrollment future of their institution. And I think we do a lot of that through stories. There's certainly other ways, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Good. Jody or Brent, would you like to add to that?
I think one thing is most institutions have a strategic plan. And a strategic plan is an outward way for an institution to say what's important to them. And so any way that you can link what you're doing with your SEM work to reinforce those core components of your strategic plan, by definition, is saying we're doing this work because it matters. It's what's important to who we are as an institution, what we believe in and what we're striving for. But as you distill that down, there's different things that come out of a well-executed SEM plan. For your senior administration, it may be increased retention and graduation, which means that makes you look a little better in the rankings. For your finance people, it could be increasing net tuition revenue. For faculty, it could be bringing higher quality students into their academic programs. Or for other areas of campus, increasing your diversity or increasing the number of students that have financial need to your community. So I think a well-executed plan does lots of those things, and lots of elements of those things are important at different corners of campus. But again, it should all be reflected in who you are as an institution and what you've said outwardly that is important to you, which is really kind of the core components of your institutional strategic plan.
Great. And can you, I'd like to ask you if we can talk just a little bit about initiative fatigue. We see that quite a bit at institutions, especially today with so many different things that are out there going on, 15 to finish and guided pathways and, on and on and on. There are a lot of things that we're asking faculty and others to do in order to get on board with initiatives. And oftentimes the SEM plan can be seen as yet another initiative that's being maybe dictated to, or the organization, or the president or board says, you've got to do this. You've got to get a SEM plan together. And so talk a little bit about maybe leveraging what you have already, overcoming initiative fatigue, those kind of things to help the organization make this smoother or easier in some way to take on.
Well, I think Christine should kick this off. It is a great acronym.
Yes, we do. I don't know if I'd want to use the acronym, though. I think that when we talk about buy-in, what fights buy-in is, as you point out, people are tired and they may not want to buy into something else. They may say, great idea, we need to do it, but I just don't know how I'm going to fit it in. And I have all these other things to do. Please tell me what's the most important thing to do. So one of the ways to look at SEM in an organization that's already stretched, that's already probably actually taking some good actions, is to look at SEM not as an add-on, but if you will, an add-in. And the acronym, the phrase we're working with is to link with what's going on, to integrate with what's going on, yet to expand it toward a more focused look at the enrollment future of the institution. We do many things, for example, guided pathways, achieving the dream, wraparound advising. We're doing all kinds of things on our campus because people have good ideas. But with sometimes each and every one of those aren't necessarily linked together. They may be linked to student success, part of this strategic plan, but they may not have coordinated themselves toward a probable end. My statement to them is, what does it all add up to? So I think with the effort to put SEM in perspective of not just a whole separate initiative, but to say, you know, we're already doing some things. Let's find out what they are and link to them. Let's link them up. Let's integrate with some of the good work that they've done, some of the data that they've found, and let's then extend that towards some more focused SEM planning. Yes, along with our strategic plan for the institution, and yes, maybe with what some of those initiatives are finding, but not quite doing.
So that's a great point, Christine. I want us to talk a little bit about some of the things that come from the outside, which create SEM imperatives, and they can be mandates, system goals, state goals, other things that come to us that can actually be used advantageously in a SEM plan to say, look, we don't need to go through a huge exercise to decide this goal. It's being given to us. So let's work with that. And if any of you had experiences where you've come into an environment where someone, either because you're working at the institution or you're working with an institution trying to help them, where they've had some type of external mandate that has helped them shape or craft their SEM plan.
Absolutely. As a state public institution, the state was looking at changing the way the funding formula worked, which was going to be driven by a specific population of students. So unless you were successful in achieving that goal, you were going to see a dramatic cut in your state appropriation. That really motivated people to want to get out and develop very concrete plans on how to best achieve that. And so sometimes those external things can kind of expedite you to move in a certain direction. The caution there is sometimes we can overcorrect in that way too. And so because of something that might happen or come externally, you almost put too much energy into something only to have a year or two later, well, that's not important anymore. We need to refocus now over here. And I think that's where you have to be careful with buy-in, because everything can't be an emergency. You have to run in 100 miles an hour, full steam ahead, and try to put out one fire, only to turn around and a year later and you're running over and trying to put out a different fire. And so I think even with external things that can sometimes influence or drive decision making, you have to take those in a calculated way as they fit into your overall SEM plan, because otherwise it can be a little bit frantic and seem a little disorganized for some of the people who are working with you on these initiatives.
Yeah, I'll add certainly from Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Plan has a segment on education. And so there are a number of schools now in Canada that are building into their SEM planning their goals around Indigenous education. And so there's a number of implications there on student experience, numbers of students recruited, numbers of students willing to also self-identify in order to receive support. And so we're seeing large numbers of institutions responding to that external key plan as a way of integrating into their own institutional plans.
I think related to that, and by the way, Jody, I think that's a big issue. When I visited a college up in British Columbia, they had received their provincial mandate to percentage-wise increase certain types of enrollment, and they had to jump too. I think one thing we're currently facing is the question marks around our international student enrollment. And that is an external thing that's playing out in uncertain ways. And I probably compelling some SEM groups to take a look at that sector of their enrollment and the effect of the possible effects and what they may or may not do about it.
Yeah, it kind of depends upon whether you're north or south of the border, right? As to what international means at this point. For those of us in the United States, of course, we've seen some really steep declines at almost every institutional type in the country. And I think a dampening effect on the ambitions of maybe growing enrollment through international students as a result of that, that there's not a hopeful attitude that there's going to be a better climate, very, very soon for that. And then, of course, north of the border in Canada, as I like to say when I go to Canada, you're welcome. You have a bevy of international students that have created its own issue in just having a lot more international students all of a sudden that you weren't anticipating. And we've certainly talked to some institutions in Canada that it makes them wonder, what do we want now? Now that we've realized success, what does that mean for us? And do we want to shape this somehow? Does it have implications for us beyond that? So it's got a disruptive factor almost in that as well. And we may want to dive into that a little bit further in our conversation on one of our topics.
I'll just to say that on SEM without a plan, we've seen schools, certainly in British Columbia and Canada, where they had explosions around international students and found themselves at 30 to 40% of their undergraduate population becoming international without a plan to have that happen. And those with a plan did more segmented growth. And so, yes, there is a response. That has implications, obviously, in the learning environment, has implications for support. And so some institutions are responding by saying, whoa, we should have had a plan in place to manage the huge numbers of growth in a very small period of time that's happened.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just want to touch on one topic in this one on getting by, and that is kind of an elemental part of this, which is creating common definitions and common vocabulary around enrollment. I found in many cases that one of the issues is that when we say enrollment, it has a different meaning for different and just trying to clarify that. Can any of you touch on that just a little bit, your own experiences, and just trying to make sure people are commonly understanding the information?
First of all, is somebody ruffling paper that we can hear on the mic? Okay, never mind. I can perhaps address that by saying that I again think that SEM evolves, and we may start out coming from different directions, and it is our continued work and conversation and working through data and building through stories that I think we begin to develop the common work and vocabulary and definitions. I think that is something that grows. You certainly don't come to it at the very first time.
I think it's also important you have those common definitions so that you don't have the experience we've all enjoyed of walking into a meeting and everyone says, but my data set says, and it's a competition of whose data is right and wrong because you're not using those common definitions. And I think one of the things that SEM does is help you really to say, what is a first-year student? What is the definition of that? What's a transfer student? Really getting a lot of that just what seems like basic language into the vernacular so that you're all using the same tools to measure how you're progressing and what you're achieving.
Another concept in that is, that a lot of times we talk about what are the enrollment goals of an institution, almost we jokingly say more and better, right? We want more and better students. And one of those clarifying elements can be not everyone wants more. In fact, some areas would prefer it if it were a little bit less in some cases. And then it's, what does better mean? And what if we had more? What would the implications be across the institution for teaching and learning, for services, for facilities? Those type of real world implications for achieving some of the enrollment growth that sometimes we say we're looking for. So how much more? If we are talking about more, how much more is more? Optimal enrollment doesn't always mean more students. But then what does better mean? Define that or come up with some metrics that can commonly describe what better students might be. And I think that is really helpful for achieving buy-in because it really creates this discussion around what we're trying to do as an organization in education. And I think those conversations get people invested in the SEM process, that they then feel like their voice is being heard and that they have some vested interest in working on the project, even a step further or 2 steps further in getting into this work.
You've touched on my confounding question, no matter where I am and what I'm thinking about with SEM, which is how do we address that question of size and type of students? Do we get that direction from our institutional strategic plan? Is it something that a president simply comes up with? Is it something that they're expecting a SEM group or other group to tell the institution? I always wish that that the institutional strategic plan would provide some direction to the enrollment future of the institution, so that it wasn't made up by just a group of people. But I've never really been able to solve that. I asked the question, what do you think your right size is? And it's very hard to get that question formulated and addressed.
Do you find it to be an iterative situation where you start down that road with a question and then as you learn more information, you get a better answer? Do you do enrollment modeling, which I find to be very helpful as a conversation starter, not as a crystal ball, but a way to model some of the potential wishes and dreams of the institution. For example, if we had higher retention rates, how many more students would we have if we did that? If we had more freshmen or more transfers or more graduates or whatever, the more might be, then what does the institution look like in 5 years? What does that lead us to? And does that satisfy the institutional appetite for enrollment, or does it cause some issues around teaching and learning and those other spaces? I think that can be a way to help answer the question. But Christine, you're absolutely correct that, oftentimes that number out there that is used for enrollment can be one that's not necessarily been well researched. I wouldn't say well thought out, because I do think that there's thought that goes into that, even if it is a number that comes from someone, but perhaps not well researched to understand how achievable that number might be. And I think that's where you get into the expectation. Perhaps the SEM process produces the number because it's going to tell us what we can achieve or not achieve throughout the next 5 or 10 years.
And I think enrollment managers have a challenge here because, size is not an indication of quality. We know that. And, you may have a plan that tells you to stay right where you are. And by achieving that, the headlines are still going to read enrollment stagnant at institution or down 1%, because that's what people are interested in hearing. So I think what a SEM plan also helps you do is replace those headlines with, as we've communicated, we're exactly where we want to be. And I think that's something that the SEM plan can help to do, because sometimes if you're trying to get to a number that's actually smaller than where you started, and you tell people that, the panic that ensues because you have one less student than you did the year before kind of gets mitigated.
Okay.
Good point.
A lot of people around this time of the year are just really thankful, or really wishing that they had the 0.1 increase in ACT average scores, right? And that's like, okay, quality went up by 0.1, right? Quality didn't really change; it just happened to go up by 0.1 points. But those are the right. We oftentimes get measured on as enrollment managers. Are there some kind of easily revealed markers of improvement in some way? Whereas the educational experience itself, the quality of the student experience, the quality of teaching and learning are much harder to put out there in a soundbite for everyone to latch onto as to whether or not something's really getting better or worse, staying the same. Great points. Okay. So let's talk a little bit next in our next topic. And I do want to remind our our audience to make sure that you're putting your questions into the question box. So as we get to the question and answer period here soon, we want to make sure to be able to interact with you a little bit today during the webinar. So let's talk about leadership. If I can, there we go, leadership. Can you reflect, please, on the leadership role in guiding the development and successful implementation of a SEM plan? And we've got a few different areas here we might want to explore. One is managing up, right? Really, how do you work with the president, chancellor, executive team, board of an institution in talking about enrollment and SEM planning? The second is leading colleagues and peers. And really managing to the side, if you will, and trying to make sure that you're communicating with and working well with your peers across the campus. And then also the third is then managing those who report to you. So we've kind of got a bit of a 360 or at least a 180 top down from the top of the organization to the front lines of the organization and to each side of it. Reflect a little bit on the qualities that you found to be important, helpful, or even unhelpful in leadership roles. Jody, do you want to start with this one?
Sure, and I'm actually going to start where I think is the most important, which is actually the managing of those that you lead and report to you, because I think those folks are really where the success of your planning will occur. And certainly recognizing the role that those individuals play in developing strategies and tactics for achieving your goals is critical. So the more we involve them, especially in the tactical development and the tactical implementation, but also not forgetting that their involvement in the assessment of those tactics. How have we done? Have we achieved what we wanted to achieve as a result of those tactics? Even when the news is not great, it's still important for your team to be involved in that assessment in order for them to reflect on how can we pivot or change our approach to still achieve the goals that we set. And then I would add finally that celebrating the opportunities for what you have achieved and encouraging your team to be involved in appreciating what they did. We often too quickly just move on to the next set of tactics, forgetting that there's a pause there that needs to happen for reflection and celebration for where you've come and where you've got the institution to be, and really having students to be able to reflect that back to your team. Their qualitative stories about what has happened for them as a student, the student that would have never been recruited, never been able to afford to come to your institution, never be able to complete their programming had it not been for all those supports that you put in place along the way as part of your response to your enrollment goals. That's what really will help your team see at the end of the day that this is mattering. It's not just something that's written down in a plan. So I'll pause there. That group is critical to, I think, any achievement of any plan.
Great. Christine, do you want to add to that?
Well, I have two angles on it. One is that I find it's not unusual for the grassroots of the organization to see pretty clearly that some SEM planning could help them. They see diversity of efforts, they're not sure where it's going, they are hit with a variety of requests, and often I think it is our grassroots folks, our line folks, who are quite willing and eager to say, we need some more planning. And so the recognition of that, the usefulness of that is I think very large and very important. And their challenge is bringing that up into the organization, saying we need this. They can't do it themselves as a group. It's a much larger effort, but to recognize that often I think we need to listen to the folks at the front lines in the grassroots, because they may be able to articulate some of the issues far better than we can, and we then need to manage up. I'll take another perspective on this, and in a way I'm reflecting some frustrations. It's the type of leadership that our presidents and vice presidents give. I had recently a president say it in just the right words. She wanted to find the sweet spot for being the presidential leader for SEM. And for her, that meant promoting the enthusiasm, providing the motivation, articulating goals, but not getting into the weeds. And that is where I think I want the executive leaders to be, from my point of view, because some of the hard situations I deal with is when the executive leaders, the president, for example, says, we need to do this, and by the way, here's how I think you need to do it. And they jump right to a lot of those strategies and telling people what to do, which sort of defeats that purpose of SEM, which is to really look around your environment and try to really suss out what are the challenges and opportunities and take advantages of multiple perspectives. So again, I hit 2 points. One, I think respect for the folks at the grassroots level and their ability to contribute to the SEM motivation and the SEM work, and helping the president find that sweet spot of motivating and giving authority, and yet not tangling down in the weeds.
Great. Brent, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important as someone leading a SEM effort is you have to establish yourself as a person in a position of credibility with those senior leaders. And that means providing them with good data that's easy to understand, that provides the context of the conversations you're having. And I think by building that relationship through establishing that trust, now you kind of are able to manage the anecdote. Because now if there's a question or a concern, they know that you're a place they can go to, or these groups that have formed are a place they can go to get the real answer. And I think that's something that's so critical, because oftentimes we see SEM efforts derailed by an anecdote of somebody's experience whose daughter tried to apply, or something along the way, when in actuality, if you were able to rein that in and provide, again, transparency, but really clear, concise data in a timely manner that addresses the issues most relevant to those in senior roles, all of a sudden, it gives a lot of credibility and a lot of authority to be able to earn that trust and be able to move forward on initiatives. And like Christine said, to have somebody who's eager and willing to lend their support because they believe in your ability to execute.
Great. Okay. I want to just remind our audience, I'm not seeing any questions yet in the box. So if you would like to get some questions in here, please do so now, because we're approaching the end of our hour and we want to make sure that we've been able to address any issues or questions that you may have for the panel today. I'm going to ask our panel to reflect on one more topic here, and that is the nature of disruption. And that we have seen SEM with the best laid plan that we've created, this great SEM plan for the next 5 to 10 years at the organization. And along comes something unseen or some major change that happens in the organization. So I'd like you to reflect a little bit on some of the experiences you've had in seeing having a SEM plan, having a forward-moving organization trying to work on something, and then something happens along the way to substantially change that. And how have you been able to react to that as an individual? And then how have you seen teams of people react to that as well at institutions? Okay, who would like to start with that one?
I'll start with a reminder that SEM plans, I have never seen one that has actually been permanently etched in stone. So if we accept that as a given, we need to accept that plans do change and that we're capable of making the change. And that if we've done a good job with our SEM planning group or our SEM division, that we are actually ready to accept that conversation. Is it disruptive? Sure, but stuff happens, and we need to simply say it was in our plan. Maybe something's changed, maybe something needs to be added on. And I think that's the beauty of having done some good groundwork in building the effort and the buy-in into the process. You've got a plan, but you also have a process, And it's that process that helps you work through change.
Yeah, and I would add that disruption doesn't necessarily have to be a negative. And so a disruption can be an opportunity for an institution that they didn't otherwise have in front of them when maybe they developed that SEM plan. And so what can you leverage from that disruption to further student success at your institution?
I think the ability to pivot from a SEM perspective, you really have to rely not only on the SEM plan itself, but also what's going on out in the world. So back to Christine's note about the grassroots, what are your recruitment staff hearing out there? What are the things that are a concern? Or is there something on social media that's being pushed around that's saying certain things that all of a sudden, whoa, we've got to manage this, we've got to control this. And so I think what we've seen, if you look back at the last 3 to 5 years, think of the number of campuses that have overnight found themselves embroiled in a really national situation that's very difficult to manage, that can leave a very lasting impression on how students and parents feel about that institution. And so I think the SEM plan is one of the ways in which you have to be prepared for what might happen tomorrow on your campus, especially in a time where we have lots of interesting issues with free speech and just there's a lot of consternation about issues. So the SEM plan is part of how the institution responds to whatever may come your way.
I think too of those times when we've had things that have happened, positive or negative. And Jody, I like your example of that. In fact, I was thinking myself of the recent spike in international enrollments in Canada as being one of those. It was all of a sudden, wow, institutions have lots of students on their campus that they weren't planning for. Has implications of its own in dealing with that. But on the other side of that, I think of how that rolled out in 2016, 2017 here in the United States. And I think one of the gifts it gave us was it made us look really deeply at international markets and ask some questions like, are there other places besides China that we should be thinking about for our foreign students? And then we learned that in fact in several years China may have a number of new universities that mean that they won't be exporting as many students. So in some ways, even what can be a negative at the beginning can become a long-term positive or opportunity for us to become stronger institutions. I also think too of those times when something happens, and I've seen institutions on both sides of this. I think those that lack the data and communication to react to something are the ones that suffer more. And those that have a robust data infrastructure where they're looking at data, they have the ability to quickly access data and analyze something. They have networks of people, formal, informal groups on the campus organized around SEM, talking to each other, can make that pivot more quickly and often more, I would say, in less of a knee-jerk reaction and more thoughtfully about, what were they trying to do originally? What was the goal of what they were trying to achieve, and have they moved themselves toward that, or maybe they're moving towards that in a new way. And then I wanted to just ask if any of you would just comment a little bit on changes in executive leadership and the impact that can have on SEM planning. Let's say, for example, you're 2 years into your SEM plan and you get a new president at the college or university. What's the impact of that on SEM planning?
I can describe a good experience. I can describe moving from executive leadership that was not really tuned into SEM planning, that had to be done at a more mid-level style because the executive wasn't tuned in, to then getting a president who said, hey, this is great. I'm glad you've got something going. Let's build on it. So that's a good story, and I'll offer that.
Great. I do want to say we've got a question online here, and I want to bring this one to the group because it's a great question. I'll read the question. is it possible or advisable to develop a specific enrollment management plan, international, et cetera, right? So a segment of what we might think of as a larger SEM plan in isolation of an institutional SEM plan. So can you do it? Is it advisable to do that in thinking about specific segments of our populations?
I would say,
Can you do it? Yes. Of course
yeah,
you can do it.
Sure.
Many of us have units that have their own operational plans and goals, and they seem to be moving ahead. And sometimes we know that that's it, sometimes cross purposes. Is it a good idea to have it be something that radically affects the enrollment of the institution and have it act in isolation? I'd say that's risky.
Okay. Very good. There was another question here and I want to respond to it. To just say that we have a request, are there links to any examples of SEM plans? Just in responding to that, I will say yes, qualified yes. Number one, that SEM plans often contain a bit of an institution's playbook and their strategy, a competitive strategy for something they're trying to do. So yes, there are some SEM plans out there that are available online. And for the person who asked the question, if you want to go to the ACRO website and find my email address, or just know that it's tom.green@acro.org, and send me an email, I can respond to you and provide you some links to some things that I know are out there online. But generally speaking, it's a little bit like playing your rival football team and saying, hey, do you mind giving us your playbook for next week? We just want an example of what a good one looks like. So we have to realize that we do this in a bit of a competitive environment. Great. So,
hey, Tom, at our
yes.
workshop, our SEM Institute at the SEM conference, toward the end, after we've worked through the SEM process and the SEM plan, one of the things we do offer is a format for a SEM plan. So it's a general sketch, a general outline.
What a great segue, Christine, to some of our upcoming things that we have here that are going on. First of all, I want to just recognize there's another webinar coming up on SEM on October 9th. And this one is on right-sizing the higher education institution. In a time of shifting demographics, we've seen some institutions that are either reactively or proactively right-sizing, meaning they are deciding to be an institution of a different size because they feel the need to do that. We'll talk about the different dynamics of that and some of the different ways that that might be happening out there today. But certainly, as we see a growing list of institutions that are merging, closing, et cetera, this is a bit of a hot topic. So we'll have Stan Henderson and I are going to talk, and Clayton Smith is going to facilitate that webinar on the 9th. And then, of course, we have our SEM conference coming up in Dallas, and that's coming up in early November. We hope you'll consider coming to the conference. And we wanted to note that we have a team experience that is happening there, and that for groups of 4 or more from the same institution, if you'd like to come to the SEM conference as a team, you may do so, and you may be eligible to have a coach, like a distinguished person of those that you may see joining me on the panel today. Wanted to note that early bird registration for SEM ends on the 27th. And if you want to have a team come, you have to have everyone registered by October 11th. Also, we did get just a comment here, the SEM Institute is full. That's the SEM Forum that is full on Tuesday. The SEM Institute still has registration places open, and that is on Sunday. It's a pre-conference workshop, just to clarify. Okay. Great. So I just hope that everyone will join me in thanking our panelists today. Brent, Christine, and Jody, thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. And to our audience members, thank you for your time today, and thank you for joining us. Please remember to complete your post-webinar survey, and that will provide you a link to the archived recording of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.